All right, hello everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Hope everyone had a chance to uh, watch the DBQ review that I posted before. Um, so today, what I want to do is go through some of this early history from 1200 to 1450. And in particular, look at the Indian Ocean system. So we'll take a look at the Arab, the East Asian, and the South Asian core regions and how they interact with other parts of this Indian Ocean system. So I want to start with a quote from Manuel Wallerstein so we can, again, put our head into this framework that we've used in the course this year, usually centered around kind of a world systems analysis. So you'll take a second to pause and read what Wallerstein has to say. So Wallerstein is looking at two ways of viewing world history, in a sense. He argues that there's a world empires approach where you're looking at things like the British Empire, looking at things like China, which are these large bureaucratic structures, right? They have a single political center, oftentimes with multiple cultures involved within these empires. And we saw that throughout the course. And the other way being looking at it from a world economy perspective, which is the big picture perspective, right? Where you have this large division of labor with multiple political centers and multiple cultures. So when we look at 1200 to 1400, for example, we look at these core regions, right? We look at the Arab core, Chinese core, and the South Asian core, and how they interact with each other and these other periphery regions around them. So I just wanted to start with that just as a reminder of our frame of analysis here. And after Wallerstein kind of lays out this form of analysis, you have other historians and sociologists picking up on it as well. People like Janet Abu-Lugo, Andre Gunder Frank, who really push his thesis back further in history. Wallerstein tends to start with the mercantilist capitalist world. So Abu-Lugo and Andre Frank, for example, push it back even further. And say that there were world systems before you had mercantilism and capitalism, which we did see in this class. So that's kind of what we'll focus on with this 1200 to 1500 period. Now, if we look at the world system today, from a map of shipping lanes or trading routes, we can see it's very different than what it was in 1200 to 1400. Here, you've got this major Atlantic system, right? 1200 to 1400, that didn't exist. Right? These lines wouldn't have been there. You also have this major Pacific system connecting the west coast of the United States to East Asia, to Japan, China, also Southeast Asia. That was not there in 1200 to 1500 either, right? So very different world today than we had in, say 1300. And the idea of the class was to see, how do we get here, right? Why do we flip these trade routes? Why are the core regions going to change over the time that we're looking at this course from 1200 to 20th century? Looking at these major continuities and changes over time from this big picture analysis, right? From a whole world system analysis. So if we look at 1200 to 1500, the world's a very different place, right? You have these circuits of trade that are all kind of centered on Afro-Eurasia. Of course, the Americas are a completely different system. They're not connected yet, right? So if we look at Afro-Eurasia, the one we'll be primarily focused on today is this Indian Ocean system. So we have these different circuits in here that connect with each other in the Indian Ocean. And this is really the center of this world system, is this Indian Ocean system. This is kind of where East Asia, South Asia, and the Arab world really come together. And South Asia being the kind of center of this exchange network, centered around places like Calicut, for example. Right? However, there are other systems that we looked at in the class too. We'll talk about the East Asian system today, centered around China. The Silk Road system in Central Asia, connecting East Asia, Central Asia, and Southwest Asia, or what we typically call the Middle East, and even Eastern Europe, right? This long overland route. Then you also have this trans-Saharan system, which connects Western and Northern Africa to each other, bringing supplies such as gold, salt, slaves, northward across the Sahara Desert into the Mediterranean, and connecting Europe with sources of precious metals. Mediterranean Sea could be seen as a system unto itself too, connecting the Middle Eastern world, which is connected to the Indian Ocean, bringing goods into Europe. All of these should be seen as circuits of trade, right? Not these individual systems. And then if you look at the Americas as well, you see the same thing happening here too, right? You look at the eastern woodlands of North America, this Mississippian system, which was completely connected through rivers and overland networks too. You also have the southwestern system over here, like the Anasazi and the Chaco Canyon, etc., which was also connected to this Mesoamerican system in Central America and Mexico, where you have the Aztecs and the Maya. And then down in South America, you have the Andean system with the pre-Inca people, the Inca, really large trade network here spanning the west coast of South America through road systems developed largely by the pre-Inca and the Inca peoples. And then you even have this Amazon system too, which we're just now learning about its cities that we're seeing through things like LiDAR and other new technologies. So, and that's something we'll come back to in the future. We'll look at the American system too. And then can't leave out the Caribbean as well, right? So connecting South America to the Caribbean islands, even to North America. And again, this is something that's new research showing was an interesting trade network in here too. All right, now looking at this Indian Ocean system and why it's important for the kind of long scope of history, and as we go from 1200 all the way up to the 20th century. So take a second and look at what Lynda Schaffer says in Southernization, and I would urge you to go back and read this. You should have the essay in your binder, so go back and read through it, because she splits it up pretty much like I have today into these core regions. So again, pause it, take a second to read what Schaffer has to say. And you look at her thesis, and what she's saying is at this time, Europe is a periphery, right? And they're not going to be able to come into core status until they're able to access these goods that are in this Indian Ocean region, right? Cotton, sugar, spices, etc. And that's where they're going to start to generate wealth from, right? Being able to access these goods that were in the Arab world, that were in South Asia, that were in China. And that's not to leave out the importance of the Americas, but you know, Schaffer's primarily focused with Afro-Eurasia at this point. So it's an interesting thesis that Schaffer has, that it's not until Europe is able to access these goods in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s that they're able to propel themselves into this kind of core status. And we'll look at how that process plays out as we review through the material. All right, so let's get into this Indian Ocean system. And I want to start by looking at this Arab region of the world, all right? So when we look at this map, obviously it's not divided perfectly, right? There's overlapping circuits here, but this is kind of just a simple way of viewing things. So what we'll look at is how the Arab world, the Indian zone, and the Chinese zone interacted with each other. Right? Now, if we look at the learning objectives that AP has laid out for us, that College Board has laid out, causes of the growth of these networks, effects of the growth of these networks, and then the environmental factors that led to the development of these networks. So we kind of take these and put them together into maybe a prompt that might be used to help us understand the DBQ, for example. this is what I came up with. Evaluate the extent to which the growth of trade networks transformed Afro-Eurasia during the period from 1200 to 1450. Now, that obviously focuses primarily on this. What was the effects of the growth of these networks? However, if this was a DBQ question, you would need this. This would be your context, for example, right? What caused this to happen? You could also use these environmental factors as context as well. Okay? So as we go through this, I will kind of use this prompt to guide us through it, to see how we would be able to answer a question like this based on this really broad topic. Okay? So we'll need some evidence, right? How did the growth of these trade networks transform the Afro-Eurasia? So my thesis for this, I'm using the DBQ rubric here. Indian Ocean was the center of a series of Afro-Eurasian trade networks joining together the Arab world, South Asia, and East Asia. Okay? Here's where we get into the meat of the thesis, though, the argument that I'm going to try to prove as I go through this. Expansion of trade networks in the Indian Ocean created the growth of cities and states. So we'll look at some evidence for that, right? Places like China, cities in China, like Guangzhou, states in the Arab world, cities in the Arab world, like Baghdad, right? Cities and city-states in East Africa, on the Swahili coast, like Kilwa. You can take a look at that. Also, the diffusion of biological consumer goods is going to have a transformative effect on Afro-Eurasia, right? You think about biological goods such as sugar, such as cotton, moving from places like South Asia or India to the Middle East. Think about consumer goods that are moving around. Things like finished cotton textiles from South Asia, things like porcelain from China. Okay? And then the last part of the thesis, you also have diffusion of syncretism of cultural traditions in each of these regions. For this time period, 1200 to 1450, what I'll focus on today is primarily the diffusion and syncretism of Islam, because its expansion is just really extraordinary during this period. So let's start with a little context, right? And we'll look at the environment first. I think that's always a good place to start. So if you're to have a successful trade network in here, you have to understand how the ocean works, the currents themselves, and more importantly, the wind systems, right? Because this is pre-industrial, right? You don't have steam-powered ships running off of coal yet. We're still using wind. So it's all about the monsoons, okay? So in the summer, you've got these wind patterns that are flowing this way. So if you're coming out of Iraq, for example, it's today Iraq, Baghdad, you come into the Persian Gulf, you can come out, and these wind patterns will take you to a place like Calicut, right? Now, this has interesting effects because you have to wait there, though, if you want to go home. You have to wait till the winter comes so you can take these winds back to where you came from. So what you end up with in a place like Calicut and other cities along the Western Indian coast and the Southern Indian coast are these diaspora cities where you have Muslim merchants who are living here for part of the year, right? And something to remember about this is they don't leave their culture behind. They don't leave their religion behind. All that comes with them, right? So you end up with this really interesting mix in India. You can also notice if you want to come out of here in the wintertime, you can make your way down the African coast, right? You can get into East Africa, which there's going to be some changes in here, right? This will become the Swahili coast, heavily influenced by Islamic trade networks. And as we'll see, a lot of changes that are going to come about in terms of culture and religion too. So really important, right? So if we're to use this as our context for a DBQ, so we're talking about adapting to environmental factors, right? The seasonal monsoons. So what does this do? This allows trade in the Indian Ocean to expand, right? You can ride these winds now, okay? But you have to adapt to these winds. So this is where technology is going to play a role, right? So you figured the winds out. Now how do you adapt to these things? So in the Arab world, you get the dhow, right? Which is a ship. You get the astrolabe, navigational device. In East Asia, you get these Chinese ships called junks, and you get navigational devices called a compass. right? So what does this mean? You've got the monsoons, you've now adapted your technology to it. So what does this mean for trade patterns? Well, these monsoons are predictable, right? They're seasonal, they're summer, they're winter. So now you have these predictable markets for luxury goods to move throughout this Indian Ocean region, right? For your merchants, for your consumers, for everybody involved, from season to season, from year to year, you know when the goods are coming, right? So for context, you know, it says not merely a phrase or reference. So what I've done, I said, all right, so you got environmental factors, you got the monsoon, you adapt to the monsoon through this technology. This technology allows for these predictable markets, right, to continue year to year to year to year to year. Okay? All right, so let's dig deeper into the Arab trade network first. Let's see what's going on here. And remember, this is what we're going to look for: growth of new cities and states. We're going to look for diffusion of biological consumer goods and diffusion of cultural traditions. Right? So let's just find some evidence for these things. Here's the Dow, right? That's your context, right? Known for this kind of triangular sail. They're fast ships, right? And then your Arab astrolabe. If you're interested in this, I believe we watched a video in class. So if you want to go on YouTube and put in astrolabe, there's a couple of videos on there to show you how to use these things. They're pretty complex, really fascinating devices. Now, as far as the growth of cities and states, we can look at a place like Baghdad, right, which is today in Iraq, where you have one of the oldest universities that's still in existence, right? Baghdad and other cities in the Middle East become these centers of learning during this period. And, you know, how do you connect that to trade and wealth? Well, a lot of this comes from patronage, right? You have wealthy merchants who donate money to educational systems. Right? Same thing happens today at Harvard, Yale, etc. People will donate all this money. There'll be a building that's constructed, and they'll slap their name on it. Right? Some of this comes through taxation, right? Through taxing, tariffs, etc. So you can get universities, school systems, religious structures built through the state too. Right? You can see that through religious structures. Right? Here's a minaret from the Abbasid area. You know, this is dating back, 700 or so years. The rest of the structure is fairly new construction, but this has still remained, right? And again, probably through the use of patronage or possibly through government taxation. Right? And markets develop around these cities, so you have this constant flow of trade and wealth coming through here that you're able to tap into. You can also look at a place like Damascus, Syria. Right? Same things are happening there too. This is the Umayyad Mosque. Again, 900-year-old mosque, quite old. Now, as far as biological diffusion of goods, here we have a map that's relating to the Islamic world, right? What's coming into the Islamic world from these other regions. We don't have time to go over all of them, but there's a couple that are really important, especially if you're looking, again, at this long delay in history, right? Moving towards the present. So you look at this list, and you got a couple here. Sugarcane and cotton are going to remain really important and transformative agricultural products, right? So in India, you have probably the origin of sugarcane, maybe Southeast Asia. I'm not real sure on that. However, at some point, probably in South Asia and India, they figure out how to granulate sugar, which is essentially dehydrating it. So you take it out of the sugar cane. There's a processing or a process to dehydrate it, which is pretty intensive. But now you can store the sugar, right? If you leave it in the cane, it's really moist. Moisture leads to rot, right? So now you can transport this sugar to different locations in the world without it rotting, right? It becomes a very important spice product. And in the Middle East, you'll see the Arab world setting up plantations as well, growing sugar over here. Some definitely more successful than the others. You'll see it in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, for example. You'll see it on some of the islands in the Mediterranean. You'll see some sugar plantations. And then, if you remember, as we move forward in time, once you get into the late 1400s, 1500s, Portugal will do their own experiments with sugarcane over here in these islands in the Atlantic, Madeira, right? which these are the first kind of experiment in sugar plantation agriculture that Europeans will engage in, which will be successful, which will jump the Atlantic over into the Caribbean and really transform, economics, social structures, etc. over there. Environmental situation. Sugarcane is a really interesting crop that has these kind of world historical implications for it. And then cotton as well, right? Cotton grown in India, processed in India as a textile, really important product for the world system. And once we get to the period of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, up here in Great Britain, for example, it will be competition with Indian cotton textiles that really kind of drives the Industrial Revolution up here. So during this period, these crops become quite popular, quite important, and that will continue throughout history, right? And then if you look at the cultural spread of Islam itself, right, where we're going to see Islam take hold. This is kind of the core area of early Islam in the green, and then you see it spread by 1500 really, really widely, right? You look at India. While India will remain, predominantly Hindu, you will have these Islamic rulers in here, the Delhi Sultanate, and then eventually the Mughal Empire itself, right? You see into Central Asia, into what's today like Turkmenistan, etc. Parts of Eastern Europe, right? What was the Byzantine Empire will become the Ottoman Empire, right? So you'll see parts of southern Eastern Europe. This is Greece in here. Very interestingly, Spain and Portugal become part of this core region of Islam, right? Really fascinating period in Western European history. But what I want to take a look at a little more detail is the Swahili coast, right? See how they are integrated into the Arab world and then this larger Indian Ocean world here. So we take a look at a place like Kilwa, right, which is right here. Okay, it's really quite far from this Arab core, right? You have to take these shipping lanes to get down here. Right? But in Kilwa, you get the largest mosque south of the Sahara Desert, right? So it becomes this very important center of Islam on the East African coast. So look at the Sahara Desert up here, really far away, right? It's this really beautiful mosque made out of stonework, which has been plastered over, right, to give it a smooth surface, and you can see some of the stonework underneath there. So just really wonderful piece of architecture, right? So how would you use a photograph like this as a piece of evidence on a DVQ, right? That can be a little bit tricky for people, but this is showing us the spread of Islam, right? The fact that there is this mosque so far down the East African coast shows the transformative nature of trade in the Indian Ocean, right? Because you have these Islamic merchants coming down, and again, not just bringing goods with them and leaving with goods, but also bringing Islam with them, and kind of transforming the culture of this East African coastal region, right? And you get the Swahili culture, which is a syncretic culture, blend of East African cultures and Arab cultures, and you get a new language that comes out of it, right? Swahili, which is a combination of Arabic and some of these East African Bantu dialects too. Another shot of the Kilwa Mosque, right? You can see some of the stonework that underlies the plaster work. Here's the outside of it. You can see the domes here. Really beautiful structure. Right? You can see some of the wealth that was created on the Swahili coast. This is also in Kilwa. This is a bathing pool at a residence, right? So just like today, you have wealthy people with their swimming pools and hot tubs, etc. That's what you see here, right? So you kind of get this social class distinctions that are arising on the East African coast due to wealth accumulation from Indian Ocean trade, right? So here is the Indian Ocean. Here's the Swahili coast, right? Here we have Kilwa, right? So what's their connection to the Indian Ocean then, right? Where's this wealth coming from? So you see all these routes that are coming off of these cities into the interior of East Africa, right? We can zoom in a little bit here. And you can see Kilwa has the southern ivory route, right? So they're bringing ivory out to the Indian Ocean and selling it out into the Indian Ocean, right? Merchants are coming in and taking this stuff away, right? However, it's not just ivory though. We've got some other things coming out of here too, right? You have this slave trade that's coming out of the East African coast too, bringing slaves into the Indian Ocean, into the core of the Islamic world. Now, interesting comparisons to make with the transatlantic slave trade, which will come off the west coast of Africa. A lot of this is geared towards female slaves. The demographics data shows us that. So you have a lot of domestic servitude happening here. You did have some plantation slavery, like I mentioned with sugar plantations, but a lot of this is domestic household servitude. And if you remember in class, we looked at some of the rules and regulations for owning slaves that were in some of these Islamic texts. So you may want to go back and look at those, so you can, in the future, make some comparisons with the transatlantic slave trade, right? And we can look at some textual sources here too. So we can go back to Ibn Battuta, right? Moroccan, North African Islamic scholar, world traveler. If you remember him from class, we read some excerpts from his text on his world travels. So if you'll take a second and just pause and see what Battuta has to say, and see how we could use this as evidence, again, for the transformative nature of these trade routes on these different regions. Okay, so he's talking about the Sultan of Kilwa, right? And the term Sultan itself is an Islamic term, right? So here again, we can see the spread of Islam into East Africa. So you have this religious and political leader in Kilwa, right? He's an Islamic leader. Interestingly, he brings up this exchange network that deals with the interior that we just looked at on the map, right? He talks about these expeditions to the land of the Zinj people, right? He says they would raid them and take booty, slaves and other wealth, right? So something to note here on this slave trade with the Zinj people. Often this wasn't about race or ethnicity so much as it was about religion, right? So they're going to raid non-Muslim peoples, often non-Christian and non-Jewish peoples too. So if you remember in class, we talked about the dhimmi, the people of the book. In the Muslim world, Christians and Jews had kind of a separate status from other people that would be referred to as pagans, right? That are outside of those three traditions. So they were fair game, essentially. He says he's a man of great humility, greatly respects men of religion and noble descent, right? So definitely can see the impact of Islam here. You can see the impact of these trade networks, which definitely is having a negative impact on the people of the interior, right? Who are being used to create wealth for people like the Sultan of Kilwa, right? So these Zinj people who are on the periphery of this Indian Ocean system are definitely being taken advantage of, right? They're being sold as slaves and they're having other things stolen from them as well, probably ivory, not sure what else, but so we can definitely see the core periphery relationship kind of playing itself out here in this one small region. So what's coming in then, right? If we know that we have ivory and slaves going out, what do we have coming in? Well, interesting archaeological evidence of massive amounts of pottery being found from China, right? So you have this porcelain coming in from China to the Swahili coast, right? So that shows you that they're purchasing these luxury goods from distant parts of the world, right? So economically, very productive place, right? You also see the pottery shards up here in the Middle East too, right up here in the Persian Gulf and Egypt, etc. Right? So these Chinese ceramics are traveling really far distance. So this luxury trade and cultural products, right? Material goods, showing up all the way over here in Southern Africa too, or Eastern Africa too. So let's turn to China then, right? So we see this connection. These places are really far apart, right? And as we look at China, again, let's think of these same things that we talked about from the beginning of our thesis. Growth of new cities and states. So we'll look at some of these cities in China. Diffusion of biological and consumer goods. We'll do that too. Biological goods like rice, consumer goods like porcelain that we just saw. and the diffusion and syncretism of cultural traditions, right? Again, we saw Islam stretching here. We'll see it again over here. Okay? So sticking with this idea of Chinese pottery making all the way to the Swahili coast, well, where's it coming from? This is from the same research by Ben Zhao. And you see the kiln sites in China, right? This mass production for the world market and the domestic market too, obviously. But this is mass production, right? You see large numbers of these kiln sites producing, right? And producing these really beautiful goods, right? So these folks in East Africa are eating off of these Chinese plates, Chinese cups, etc. Now, Battuta goes to China too, right? So we can get some evidence from his experience in China for the transformative nature, again, of this global trade at this point. So again, take a second, pause it, see what Battuta has to say about China. Okay. He mentions in the beginning, India has sent an ambassador, right? So you definitely have these political connections, right? He mentions a junk, which is that Chinese ship, right? But here's where I think things get even more interesting, right? He mentions that in every city in China, you have a Muslim quarter, right? This is where the Muslims live. This is where their mosques are, where the prayers are conducted, etc. He says they're treated with respect, right? Highly regarded, right? Interesting note here. They're delighted when a Muslim arrives among them, right? So they say that he was happily received, right? Even Battuta was. However, he was not very happy in China. He didn't like living amongst what he calls the infidels. Okay? His time in China was not a very good time for him, according to his writings on this. Here's a representation of a Chinese junk, kind of a modern representation. You can see through the distinctive sails. But I'll show you some much bigger ships here in just a minute. By the time you get to the early 1400s, these Chinese ships are massive. And then you've got other technology that's coming out to enable all this to happen. Things like the compass, which by the Tang Dynasty probably looks something like this with a magnetic needle, something similar to what we would look at today. Again, one more example of some East Asian, some Chinese porcelain for the global market. Here you have really interesting syncretic piece. It's a Ming Dynasty era brush holder, brush rest. Okay? You can see the Arabic inscription on it, right? And this is for the foreign market. However, it is also in the shape of traditional Chinese characteristics. This is the 5 mountains of Taoism. Right? So really interesting piece. Which probably came out of one of these kiln sites, right? So again, you've got this mass production, right? Now, let's look at what's happening in China internally a little bit to see how this connects with the globalization that's happening. And again, we'll go back to an environmental context here. Primarily dealing with food, right? So if you remember, we looked at the Qingming scroll in class. Really amazing piece of art. And in the Qingming scroll, if you remember, we saw these rice paddies, right? And we discussed how we had this new variety of rice that was being grown in China at this time. Really quite important development. So take a second and see what Lynda Schaffer has to say about this. This is not from Southernization, it's from another text by Schaffer. And, you know, if you remember to our analysis in class, this rice comes from what's now Vietnam, or the Champa region. So it becomes known as Champa rice, right? And the importance of it is relatively drought resistance, which means you don't have to grow it in the valleys necessarily. You can grow it on higher land. You can terrace your mountains, your hilly slopes. And then the other really important part about it is it ripens much, much faster than the previous variety they were using. So you can get 2 crops out of it, right? You can double the amount of food, right? Sometimes you can triple crop it, just depending on where you're at in terms of climate. So you have essentially doubled, tripled the amount of food in some places, which is going to definitely increase the density of your population. And by the end of this period, you know, China's population will double. That's huge, right? And the effects of that are seen also in the Qingming scroll, right? You keep moving down the scroll and you get to this urban scene, right? The more people you have, the more urban density you're going to have, right? So here's the city gates. You see some camels leaving the gates, definitely a sign of trade, right? And then you get the marketplace too. The lower marketplace here on the bottom floor, you've got these shops. Up above, people living above the shops, right? Very kind of cosmopolitan urban culture. You have this guy just kind of hanging out up here, relaxing in his window, right? Just remember, we looked at a lot of stuff when we looked at the Qingming scroll. You could look at social class distinctions, right? You have people being carried around in a litter, right? So just really interesting piece that really shows us the urban density that's occurring in China and the marketplace activity, right? That's coming from this connection to international trade. And again, we can look at another textual source, Marco Polo, another global traveler, right? This guy's from Venice. He's a merchant. He makes his way to China too. And here is his description of Guangzhou, what he calls Zaiton. So again, take a second to pause, read what he has to say. And what you see is he's describing just this bustling port, right? And he tells you you have all these ships from India coming here to buy products from China, right? Probably porcelain, silk. And not only do you have ships from India, but then you have regional merchants coming from southern China, right? To the port to buy goods and distribute throughout southern China. And he makes an interesting comparison in the end here. He says for every shipload of pepper from India that goes to Alexandria or Christendom, you know, he's referring to Europe here, there will be 100 that are coming to China, right? So you see the definite effect of this population growth, the desire for luxury goods like pepper and other food products. He says it's one of the 2 greatest havens in the world for commerce, right? So being connected to this Indian world system, really, really radically transforming the way these cities operate, right? And then, of course, by the time you get to the 14th century, you can see that the merchants getting tired of carrying around all this coin, all this silver and gold, right? So they try this experiment in paper money, right? If you remember when we looked at this in class too, these stamped pieces of paper that they call treasury notes, right? This doesn't last very long. As we discussed in class, you get problems with inflation, etc. But it is an attempt, right? And of course, we'll see the world moving to this in the future. Now, one more thing we should look at before we move away from China is the expeditions of Zheng He, right? He comes out of the Ming Dynasty. These are just really incredible expeditions, right? I mean, you can see the size of one of Zheng He's ships here compared to the size of one of Columbus's ships, right? Just really no comparison. And according to the record, these are massive flotillas of ships. So you would have about 100 ships, maybe not all this size, but several that were this size and several smaller junks that were coming with it. So these massive flotillas floating around this Indian Ocean world, right? And the question is, well, why? What are they doing, right? What's the purpose of these massive expeditions? And from the records, you know, we can kind of get an idea of what's going on here. You know, they're essentially trying to assert kind of a Confucian world order, especially in Southeast Asia here, where China is seen as kind of the father country, right? Where you have these relationships with these other countries that are based on that hierarchy of nations, right? And you have tribute being paid back and forth between China and these smaller countries, right? And it kind of goes both ways, right? And in the records from Zheng He, you have China deposing people in certain areas. Like in Palimba, for example, they take out the leader of Palimba and put somebody in there that's more to their liking. Okay? So this is kind of an interesting example of Chinese imperialism that's not just land-based, it's also kind of water-based, right? But it doesn't last long, right? It's only 1405 to 1423, so they end it. And you look at how close this is to the European expeditions, right? It's shortly after this that the Europeans start to try to bounce their way down the west coast of Africa and make it around into here. So it would have been interesting to see a meeting between these European ships and these massive Chinese flotillas, right? And notice Zheng He's expedition makes it over here to the Swahili coast, right? I mean, these are far-ranging expeditions, right? So marks, you can go back and read your marks on Zheng He. He does a great job of discussing this, right? And then again, here's Marco Polo talking about Indonesia, right? This is a place we'll come back to again in the future, right? These, what the Europeans would call the Spice Islands, right? What we refer to as Java at the time. So if you want to pause for a second, take a look at what Marco Polo has to say about this region, right? And you see he brings up cloves, right? So if you remember, we talk about European incursion into the Indian Ocean, these cloves become quite important to the Dutch, right? They take over Indonesia and set up this monopoly in cloves, right? So long time desirable good, right? Now, last place we want to look at is South Asia, right? What's today India, Pakistan, Bangladesh region, right? And again, we want to look at the growth of cities and states, diffusion of biological consumer goods, and then the diffusion and syncretism of cultural traditions, right? And we see all this here too, right? Especially with these Western Indian coastal cities like Calicut, right? These are growing tremendously because of this trade. And I'll show you a source, textual source, that talks about what happens to cities like this as this Muslim trade networks becomes really, really predominant, right? And really starts to kind of dominate these sea lanes, right? As far as biological and consumer goods, again, you've got sugar coming out of here, right? And then as far as a consumer good, we'll look at these cotton textiles, right? These extremely important throughout the course of history, right? As we move into the Industrial Revolution, again, it'll be the main competition for Britain with these Indian cotton textiles. And then the diffusion and syncretism of cultural traditions. Again, think about Western India and the diaspora Muslim communities that are in here, right? That's a great example of that. So let's take a second to look at some of these cotton textiles and talk briefly about why they're so important, right? So this is from the 14th century. These are block printed textiles, right? So you can kind of zoom in on it here and you can see that, right? So they would use these wooden block stamps essentially to stamp these out, right? And these are highly desirable, right? Cotton as a fabric, already highly desirable. And then the beautiful patterns that they can place on them. And they're cranking these things out, right? You have the caste system in India, right? So people kind of have a role. So you have these block printers, you have people working on the looms, you have the agricultural workers, right? So it's a system that definitely relies on that system of caste too, to mass produce these things, right? It's another example, right? And they are producing these for the world market, right? This is for the Indonesian market, right? And of course, as you move forward in time, they'll start producing for the European market, right? Very specifically for the European market. So this is from the 1700s, prior to the Industrial Revolution, when you have the British, the French, the Dutch, etc., working in the Indian Ocean to bring textiles back to Europe and sell them. So this is an example of something that was produced for the Dutch, right? And you can see it, right? You zoom in on it and you can see these Europeans here, right? Now, we'll close with one more primary source, one more textual source from 1516, right? So as the Portuguese arrive, and kind of see the transition that's happening, but he does a good job of kind of laying out what was going on before they got there. So again, pause it, take a second to read through this. So in this, we see how important these Muslim networks of exchange have become over this period of time, right? talking about Calicut in India, right, in Western India. And then what he tells us is the Muslims that are in Calicut control all, or used to control all the sea trade from that town, right? That's pretty remarkable, right? And it's not just local Muslims, right? You have what he calls the foreign Muslims, right? The Arabs, the Persians, the Gujaratis, right? Says they're great merchants. They sail to all parts of the world with their goods. And interestingly, says they have their own Muslim leader in Calicut who rules over them and disciplines them as necessary, right? The Hindu king does not have to do that, right? So they're kind of this autonomous group of people in Calicut who are self-governing, right? So again, you think about the effect on cities and states of this transnational trade network that's growing at this time, and you can see the power that the merchants have, right? Where these political leaders in these cities kind of have to defer to them, right? And you have to assume that the tariffs, the taxes, what the leaders of Calicut are getting out of this is probably not a bad deal for them, right? They're probably getting quite wealthy off of this trade. And you will see this document. I'm going to give you a DBQ to work on after this, and this will be one of the documents in there. So you'll be using this again. Okay? So again, just to review briefly, right? Evaluate the extent to which the growth of trade networks transformed Afro-Eurasia. And that's where we looked at these cities and states. We looked at the diffusion of these biological consumer goods. We looked at the diffusion and syncretism of cultural traditions. And I gave you examples from all of these different places, right? So those examples would be the body of your essay, right? That's where you prove that this actually happened, right? So again, I would urge you to go back and read Southernization so you can get Lynda Schaffer's take on these different zones of influence, right? And what's coming out of them. That's a good review for this time period. Also go back and read your Marx too. So we'll end again with this same quote from Schaffer, right, where she's talking about why this period is important for understanding what happens in the future, right? Because it's again, Europe needs access to this stuff. They don't have it right now. They're on the periphery, right? You don't even see them on the map, okay? It's not until they're able to round the coast of Southern Africa and get over here that you're going to start to see some disruptions in the system. But it's not something that happens immediately, right? That's something we need to remember. This is a couple 100-year process before colonialism really is able to take hold in here by Europe. And we'll talk about that in the future, okay? So again, don't forget, I hope you're rereading your Marx. It's a great review. He does a good job of kind of summarizing, going all the way from the 1400s up to the present. So this is a great way to get some of that global context and some of that background knowledge that you're going to use for this DBQ. All right. So until next time, hope everybody's well. Miss you guys, and y'all take it easy.